The banging on the door came before dawn, hard enough to shake the frame, and Lyra Voss was awake before her eyes even opened. She knew that knock. It was the knock of soldiers, not neighbors. And in Asheville that knock only ever meant one thing. She sat up in the dark, her heart already racing, and heard her father's voice cracking as he answered the door. Then she heard the words that would end her old life forever. "The wolves are here for the bride." Her younger sister Wren screamed from the next room. Lyra was already moving, pulling a shawl over her shoulders, running barefoot across the cold wooden floor. She reached the front room, just as 3 armored men stepped inside, their eyes cold, their swords sheathed, but their hands resting on the hilts like a warning. Behind them stood a man in a long gray coat, holding a scroll with the royal seal of Veyrath pressed into red wax. Her father stood frozen, his face pale as ash. Wren was crying into her mother's shoulder, shaking so hard she could barely stand. The treaty had been signed months ago. Everyone in Asheville knew it. But somehow they had convinced themselves the day would never actually come. A daughter of the border town, given to the Alpha King, in exchange for peace after years of war and hunger. It sounded like an old story, the kind told to frighten children. Now it was standing in their kitchen, with swords at its side. The man in gray unrolled the scroll and read the name written upon it in careful, elegant script. Wren Voss. The room went silent, except for her sister's sobbing, which grew louder, more desperate, more broken. Lyra looked at her sister, 17 years old, thin as a reed, terrified of her own shadow, and something inside her chest turned to stone. She stepped forward before she had time to think it through. "I am Lyra Voss," she said, her voice steady even though her knees felt weak. "I am the elder daughter. I will go in her place." The soldiers exchanged a glance. The man in gray studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether she was foolish or brave, and then he simply shrugged, as though it made no difference to him which sister he dragged away. "A bride is a bride," he said. "Get your things. We leave within the hour." Her mother tried to argue, tried to explain that the treaty named Wren specifically, but the man in gray did not care about names written on paper when a living girl stood in front of him offering herself freely. "Fewer complications that way," he said, almost bored. Lyra did not wait for her mother to finish arguing. She went to her room, packed a small bag with a few clothes, a carved wooden bird her father had made her as a child, and a knife she kept hidden beneath her mattress, more out of habit than any real hope it would help her against wolves. Her father caught her arm in the hallway, his eyes wet, his voice barely above a whisper. "You do not have to do this, Lyra. There has to be another way." "There isn't," she said, because she already understood something her father refused to accept. The treaty demanded a bride from Asheville, or war would return, and war had already taken too much from their town, too many husbands and sons who never came home from the border skirmishes. If a wedding could buy them peace, then a wedding was cheaper than what they had already paid. She did not cry when she left the house. She looked back once at Wren, who stood in the doorway shaking, guilt already written across her young face, and Lyra gave her the smallest of smiles, the kind meant to say, "It is all right. I chose this. Live your life." Then she climbed onto the carriage the soldiers had brought, and the wooden wheels began turning toward a kingdom she had only ever heard about in frightening stories told around winter fires. The road north grew colder with every passing mile. Asheville's gentle green hills gave way to jagged gray mountains, and the trees grew tall and dark, blocking out most of the sunlight. Lyra watched the changing landscape through the carriage window, trying to memorize every detail of home before it disappeared behind her. The man in gray, who introduced himself only as Steward Corwin, sat across from her, with the patience of someone who had made this journey many times before. "You do understand what you have agreed to," Corwin said at one point, breaking the long silence. "You are not simply marrying a man. You are marrying the Alpha King of Veyrath. His temper is legendary, his grief even more so." "Grief," Lyra repeated, curious despite herself. Corwin's expression shifted, something almost sympathetic crossing his sharp features. "He lost his first mate years ago, in an attack many believe came from your side of the border. He has never forgiven it, and now he is being forced to marry a human woman, as payment for a war he still blames on human hands. He will not welcome you kindly." Lyra absorbed this information quietly, filing it away. She had expected coldness, she had expected fear, perhaps even cruelty, but grief was something else entirely, something that explained rather than simply threatened. Still, None of it changed what waited for her at the end of this road, and none of it made her regret standing where her sister should have stood. By the second day of travel, the carriage began climbing through a mountain pass thick with fog, and Lyra caught her first glimpse of Veyrath's capital, rising from the mist, like something out of legend. Towers of dark stone stood against a bruised purple sky, banners bearing the sigil of a snarling wolf snapping in the wind. The air itself felt different here, charged with something ancient and untamed, and Lyra felt every hair on her arms rise as they passed through the iron gates. Guards lined the courtyard when the carriage finally stopped, all of them impossibly tall, impossibly still, watching her descend with expressions she could not read. She kept her chin high despite the way her stomach twisted with nerves. She would not give any of them the satisfaction of seeing her afraid, even if fear sat heavy behind her ribs like a stone she had swallowed whole. A woman approached her first, older, with silver, streaked through dark hair, and kind eyes that seemed out of place among the cold stone and colder stairs. This was Marin, the palace healer, who had been sent to prepare Lyra for the ceremony that would take place within hours, not days, as Lyra had expected. There was no time for adjustment, no gentle introduction to her new life. There was only a wedding dress, a rushed bath, and Marin's soft voice, offering the only kindness Lyra would receive that day. "He is not cruel by nature," Marin whispered while braiding flowers into Lyra's hair. "He has simply forgotten how to be anything else. Do not let his coldness convince you that you are unwanted here. Sometimes the coldest doors hide the warmest rooms." Lyra wanted to believe her, but as she stood before the tall mirror in her borrowed wedding dress, staring at a stranger's reflection wearing another stranger's future, she could only think of one thing. Somewhere beyond these walls stood a king, who hated her before ever meeting her, a king who blamed her people for a wound that had never healed, and in a matter of hours she would stand before him and become his wife, whether either of them wanted it or not. The ceremony hall was larger than anything Lyra had ever seen, its ceiling lost somewhere in shadow, its walls lined with wolf lords and their families, all watching with open curiosity as she walked the long aisle alone. No father to escort her, no family present at all, only strangers, judging her with narrowed eyes, whispering behind gloved hands. She kept her pace steady, her shoulders back, refusing to let her legs shake even though they wanted to. And then she saw him. Draven Ashgrave stood at the altar like a carved statue, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in black and silver, a crown of dark iron resting on his brow. A scar ran along his jaw, pale against otherwise flawless skin, and his eyes, when they finally settled on her, held nothing but ice. No warmth, no curiosity, only barely restrained fury, the kind that simmered just beneath the surface, waiting for an excuse to boil over. She reached the altar and stood before him, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the entire hall holding its breath around them. He studied her the way a soldier studies an enemy, searching for weakness, and Lyra refused to give him any to find. She lifted her chin higher and met his gaze without blinking. The priest began the ceremony, ancient words in an old tongue that Lyra barely understood. Binding words meant to tie two lives together, whether those two lives wanted binding or not. She repeated her vows when instructed, her voice clear despite the crowd's judgment pressing down upon her like weight. Draven's vows came slower, each word deliberate, each syllable sharp enough to cut. And then, as the priest instructed them toward the final vow, Draven leaned down toward her, close enough that only she could hear him clearly, his breath warm against her ear, despite the ice in his voice. "You will beg for mercy," he said quietly. "Before this is finished, you will beg me for mercy, and I will not give it." The threat should have frightened her. Perhaps, on any other day, in any other life, it would have. But Lyra had already survived the worst thing life could throw at her, watching her town starve through years of war, watching neighbors bury sons who never should have died so young. A king's anger, however sharp, however ancient, was nothing compared to what she had already carried. She smiled instead, calm and unshaken, and answered him loud enough for the front rows to hear clearly. "I never beg." The hall fell utterly silent. Even the priest paused, glancing between them with wide eyes, uncertain how to proceed after such a moment. Draven's jaw tightened, something unreadable flickering behind his cold eyes, surprise perhaps, or something closer to respect he refused to acknowledge. No one in this kingdom had ever spoken to him that way. Certainly not a human bride forced upon him by treaty. Certainly not on their wedding day in front of every lord and lady of his court. The priest cleared his throat and finished the ceremony quickly, eager to move past the tension crackling through the hall. When it was done, when the final words were spoken and the binding complete, Draven did not offer his hand. He did not smile, did not welcome her, did not acknowledge her as anything more than an obligation fulfilled. He simply turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone at the altar, while the entire court watched, whispering behind their hands about the strange new queen who had dared to smile at a threat, instead of trembling before it. Lyra stood there a long moment, feeling every eye in the hall upon her, feeling the weight of a kingdom's judgment pressing down on her narrow shoulders. She thought of Ren, safe at home, spared from this fate. She thought of her parents, praying for peace they would now receive because of what she had done. And she thought of the man who had just promised to break her, who had underestimated her already, without knowing a single thing about who she truly was. Let him try, she thought, straightening her spine as she finally turned to follow the servants leading her toward her new chambers. Let him try to break something that has already survived worse than any king could imagine. Behind her, the wolf lords continued whispering, already placing bets on how many weeks the human bride would last before she broke beneath the weight of her husband's hatred. None of them understood yet that Lyra Voss did not know how to break. She only knew how to bend, adapt, and survive. And survival was a skill she had been practicing her entire life. As the great doors of the ceremony hall closed behind her, sealing her inside a kingdom that wanted her gone, before she had even truly arrived, Lyra allowed herself one single breath of doubt, one flicker of fear, for the unknown road ahead. Then she pushed it down, deep where no one could see it, and walked forward into whatever waited for her next, refusing to let a crown of ice see her shiver. The whispers followed her all the way down the marble corridor, sharp little sounds that slipped through half-closed doors and behind painted screens. Lyra kept walking, her eyes forward, refusing to let her steps slow no matter how many wolf lords leaned close to their neighbors to trade opinions about the strange human girl who had smiled instead of trembling. A servant girl named Talia led her onward, silent and stiff, clearly under strict orders not to speak more than necessary. The chambers they finally reached sat at the very end of the north wing, far from the warmth of the main halls, tucked into a corner where the wind found every crack in the old stone. The room was small, the furniture worn, the fireplace cold and unlit, despite the chill already creeping through the walls. Lyra understood immediately what this placement meant. She had not simply been given the smallest room in the palace. She had been given a message. Talia set down her single bag without a word and turned to leave, but Lyra caught her arm gently before she could disappear through the door. "Please," Lyra said quietly, "is there any way to have a fire lit tonight?" Talia's eyes flicked toward the hallway, checking for anyone listening, and then she nodded once, quickly, before hurrying away without another sound. It was a small kindness, barely anything at all, but Lyra held onto it like a lifeline in an unfamiliar sea. Night fell heavier than she expected, the mountain darkness thick and absolute, broken only by distant howls that echoed through the valley below the palace walls. Lyra sat by the small fire Talia had eventually managed to light, wrapped in a blanket too thin for the cold, and allowed herself finally to think about everything that had happened since dawn. Her sister's tears, her father's guilt, a king's threat spoken like a vow at the very altar meant to bind them together. She did not sleep well that first night, jolting awake at every unfamiliar sound, every creak of old wood settling, every distant howl that seemed to grow louder the longer she listened. By morning she was exhausted but resolved, dressing in the plainest clothes she had brought, determined to explore this strange new world with clear eyes, rather than hide away in fear behind a locked door. The palace, she quickly discovered, was enormous, its halls branching in every direction like the roots of some ancient tree. Servants moved briskly through corridors, carrying trays and folded linens, most of them avoiding her gaze entirely, as though acknowledging her presence might invite trouble down upon their heads. She passed grand rooms, filled with tapestries, depicting old battles, portraits of wolf kings long dead, their painted eyes seeming to follow her as she walked beneath them. It was in the kitchens that she first found something resembling warmth. A cook, named Osric, broad-shouldered and gruff-voiced, nearly dropped a pot of stew when he turned and found the new queen standing quietly in his doorway. He stammered an apology, clearly uncertain of the proper etiquette for addressing royalty, who had wandered uninvited into his domain, but Lyra simply smiled and asked if she might watch him work. Osric's confusion slowly gave way to cautious conversation, and within an hour, Lyra had learned more about the palace's true workings than any noble could have told her. She learned which servants had been with the family longest, which ones feared losing their positions, which parts of the kitchen staff whispered sympathy for a young queen thrown into a den of wolves who did not want her. Osric even admitted, quietly, that most of the staff had expected her to weep through her first breakfast, rather than ask questions about seasoning and supply routes. "I don't weep easily," Lyra told him, and something about the simple honesty of the statement made Osric laugh, a rough, surprised sound that echoed off the stone walls. Over the following days, Lyra continued exploring, continued asking questions, continued treating every servant she met with the same quiet respect she would have shown a neighbor back in Ashfell. She learned the name of the stable master, a stern man named Edwin who softened considerably once he realized she genuinely wanted to know how the horses were faring after the long winter. She learned the healer Marin's history, how she had served 3 generations of the royal family and had buried more grief within these walls than most people carried in a lifetime. Word of her kindness spread slowly at first, then faster, servant to servant, whispered in kitchens and hallways where nobles rarely bothered to listen. The staff who had once looked at her with pity or suspicion began offering small gestures in return, an extra blanket left outside her door, a warm meal brought without being asked, directions given freely when she seemed lost in the palace's endless corridors. Draven noticed none of this at first, locked away in his own grief and duties, meeting with his council about border tensions and grain shortages, refusing to acknowledge the wife he had vowed to break. But eventually, even a king isolated behind stone walls and old anger begins to hear things, and what he heard confused him more than anything else could have. His personal guard, a quiet, weathered man named Callum, mentioned it first, almost in passing, while reporting on unrelated matters. "The kitchen staff speak well of the queen," Callum said carefully, watching for his king's reaction. "She has not once complained about her chambers, though they are the coldest in the palace. She has been seen helping carry supplies when the delivery carts arrived short of hands." Draven said nothing in response, his expression unreadable, but something flickered briefly behind his eyes, something like confusion layered over suspicion. He had expected tears. He had expected complaints, demands for better treatment, perhaps even attempts to manipulate the staff into sympathy for her plight. He had not expected quiet competence, patient kindness, a woman who simply refused to perform the role of victim he had assigned to her. He decided to see for himself, though he told no one this was his intention, arriving unannounced at the stables one afternoon, under the pretense of checking on a favored horse. He found Lyra there instead, sleeves rolled up, helping Edwin muck out stalls without a single complaint about the smell or the labor, laughing at something the old stable master had said, her hair pulled back and her cheeks flushed from the effort. She noticed him before he could retreat unseen, and for a moment they simply stared at each other across the stable yard, neither speaking, the tension from their wedding day still hanging thick between them. Then she straightened, wiping her hands on her apron, and offered a small nod that was neither warm nor cold, simply acknowledging his presence the way one might acknowledge any passing stranger. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice carefully neutral. He said nothing for a long moment, his eyes taking in the sight of her working alongside servants, rather than demanding they serve her instead. "Most humans in your position would expect to be waited upon," he finally said, his tone testing rather than kind. "I am not most humans," she replied simply, and turned back to her work as though he were not standing there at all, as though a king's attention meant nothing to her whatsoever. The dismissal, however subtle, struck him harder than any argument could have. He was used to fear, used to deference, used to people scrambling to please him, or flinching away from his temper. He was not used to being treated as unremarkable, as simply another presence in a stable yard that had more important things happening within it than a king's brooding silence. He left without another word, but the encounter lingered with him, longer than he wanted to admit, replaying itself in his mind through the following days, as he sat through council meetings and border reports, distracted by the image of his human wife, laughing beside a stable master, utterly unbothered by his presence or his power. Meanwhile, Lyra continued her quiet work throughout the palace, slowly earning trust from those who had initially expected her to fail. She began learning the wolf tongue from an elderly scribe named Aldrich, who found her curiosity refreshing after decades of nobles who cared nothing for history or language. She began sitting with Marin in the healer's quarters, learning about herbs and remedies, discovering that the healer's kindness ran deeper than simple duty, that Marin genuinely wished for the young queen to find some measure of peace within these cold walls. It was Marin who eventually told her more about the king's grief, filling in details that Steward Corwin had only hinted at during their journey north. His first mate had been a gentle soul, Marin explained one evening as they sat together preparing medicines, killed during a raid many believed originated from the human border towns, though the full truth had never been properly investigated. Draven had been young then, barely into his reign, and the loss had hardened something inside him that had never truly softened since. "He blames my people," Lyra said quietly, understanding settling over her like a heavy blanket. "He blames everyone," Marin corrected gently, himself included, though he would never admit such a thing aloud. Grief like that does not simply fade with time. It changes shape, hides in different corners, waits for excuses to surface again. You became his excuse the moment the treaty named a human bride. Lyra absorbed this quietly, feeling something shift within her own understanding of the man she had married. His cruelty at the altar had not been born from simple hatred, but from wounds that had never properly healed, wounds that predated her entirely, wounds she had inherited through circumstance, rather than any fault of her own. It did not excuse his threat, did not soften the memory of his cold words spoken like a vow, but it gave her something else to consider, beyond simple anger in return. That night, as she lay awake listening to the distant howls echoing through the mountains, Lyra found herself thinking not of escape or resentment, but of the strange puzzle her marriage had become. A king who wanted her broken. A palace slowly warming toward her despite his coldness. A grief so old it had calcified into something resembling stone, waiting perhaps for someone patient enough to finally crack it open. She did not know yet whether she wanted to be that person. She only knew that she refused to be the victim he expected, refused to beg for mercy he had promised never to give, and refused to let his ancient wounds define the entirety of her new life within these unfamiliar walls. Whatever came next, she would meet it the same way she had met everything else since leaving Ashfell behind. With her chin raised, her spine straight, and no intention whatsoever of breaking beneath a king's cold threats. Weeks passed, and the palace slowly began to shift around her, though Draven remained mostly absent from her daily life, buried in council meetings and border disputes that kept him away from the wing where she now lived almost independently. Lyra did not mind the distance at first. It gave her room to breathe, room to learn, room to build something of her own, within walls that had never wanted her. She began spending her mornings with Aldrich, the old scribe, poring over ancient records written in the elegant looping script of the wolf tongue. He taught her patiently, delighted by a student who asked thoughtful questions rather than simply memorizing words to please a tutor. Within weeks, she could read simple passages aloud, stumbling occasionally over unfamiliar sounds, but improving with a speed that surprised even Aldrich himself. Her afternoons belonged to Marin, who taught her the properties of mountain herbs, which roots eased fever, which leaves calmed an anxious mind, which barks could stop bleeding when applied correctly to a wound. Lyra found something deeply satisfying in this knowledge, a sense of usefulness that had nothing to do with her title or her marriage, everything to do with her own two capable hands. Evenings often found her in the stables with Edwin, or occasionally in the kitchens with Osric, listening to stories of the palace's long history, learning names and faces that had once been strangers and were slowly becoming something like friends. She noticed, too, how the general suspicion that had once followed her through every hallway had begun to soften into something closer to curiosity, and in some cases, genuine warmth. It was General Silas who first spoke openly of the shift happening among the staff and lower-ranking pack members. He was an old soldier, one of Draven's most trusted advisors, gruff and battle-scarred, with little patience for court politics or empty flattery. He found Lyra one afternoon in the palace gardens, tending quietly to a bed of herbs Marin had asked her to look after, and he stood watching her for a long moment before finally speaking. "You surprise me," he said bluntly, his arms crossed over his broad chest. Lyra glanced up, brushing dirt from her hands, unbothered by his directness. "Is that a compliment, General, or a warning?" "Perhaps both," he admitted, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Most nobles who marry into this family expect servants to tend their gardens for them. You are out here with dirt beneath your fingernails, learning the language, learning the medicine, learning the very bones of this palace, as though you intend to stay for good." "I do intend to stay," she said simply, "whether anyone here wants me to or not." Silas studied her a moment longer, something like respect settling into his weathered features. "Then perhaps you should know that not everyone here wishes you gone," he said quietly. "Some of us remember what it cost this kingdom to keep fighting a war neither side could win. Some of us are grateful for peace, however it arrived, and grateful too that the peace came wrapped around a woman with more spine than half the lords in this court combined." His words settled into her chest like warmth after a long, cold winter, the first true acknowledgement from someone close to the king's inner circle that her presence might mean something beyond simple obligation. She thanked him quietly, and from that day forward, Silas became something of a quiet ally, offering guidance when she needed it, defending her subtly during council discussions she was not permitted to attend but somehow always heard about afterward. Not everyone welcomed her growing influence, however. Among the wolf lords who had witnessed her bold words at the altar, resentment simmered beneath polite smiles and careful courtesy. Lady Freya, a cousin of the king with ambitions of her own, made no secret of her disapproval, finding excuses to criticize Lyra's manners during rare public appearances, questioning her right to walk freely through halls meant for those born into wolf blood, rather than married into it through treaty. Lyra endured these small cruelties with the same patience she applied to everything else, refusing to give Freya the satisfaction of a reaction, refusing to let petty insults distract her from the larger work of building a life within these unfamiliar walls. She had faced worse than jealous words back in Ashfell, had faced hunger and grief, and the constant fear of losing everything to a war that never seemed to end. A noble woman's disdain barely registered against memories like those. Still, the tension between them grew steadily, reaching a small breaking point during a formal dinner meant to honor visiting dignitaries from a neighboring territory. Freya, seated close enough to be heard by half the table, made a comment about human brides lacking the proper breeding to understand pack customs, her voice dripping with false sweetness that fooled no one paying attention. Lyra set down her fork calmly, meeting Freya's gaze without flinching. "Perhaps breeding matters less than character," she said evenly, her voice carrying just far enough for the nearby tables to hear clearly. "I have found that kindness cannot be inherited through blood alone. It must be chosen, again and again, regardless of where one was born." The table fell briefly silent, several guests exchanging glances, clearly unaccustomed to seeing the quiet human queen speak so directly against a member of the royal family. Freya's cheeks flushed, caught between embarrassment and fury, but she said nothing further, retreating instead into stiff silence for the remainder of the meal. Draven, seated at the head of the table, had watched the entire exchange without comment, his expression carefully guarded. But later that night, as Lyra walked back toward her chambers through the quiet corridors, she found him waiting near her door, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable in the dim torchlight. "You handled my cousin well," he said, the closest thing to a compliment he had offered since their wedding day. Lyra paused, studying him carefully, uncertain of his intentions. "I only spoke the truth," she replied cautiously. "The truth is rarely welcomed in this court," he said, something almost like amusement flickering across his features before disappearing again, behind his usual coldness. "You continue to surprise everyone here, myself included." "Is that meant as praise, Your Majesty?" she asked, echoing Silas's earlier question back at him, or a warning. Draven's jaw tightened slightly, and for a moment, she thought he might simply turn and walk away, as he had done so many times before. Instead, he remained standing there, studying her, with an intensity that made her pulse quicken despite herself. "Neither," he finally said, "simply an observation. I expected you to wilt within weeks. You have done the opposite entirely." "Did you want me to wilt?" she asked quietly, genuinely curious. He did not answer immediately, and something in his silence told her more than words could have. Finally, he shook his head slightly, as though shaking away a thought he did not wish to examine too closely. "Good night, Lyra," he said, using her name for the first time since their wedding, and then he turned and walked away before she could respond, leaving her standing alone in the corridor, with her heart beating strangely fast. She entered her chambers that night, feeling something shift within the careful walls she had built around her own heart. A small crack of curiosity, where certainty had once stood firm. She did not trust him, not fully. Not after the threat he had spoken so coldly at their altar. But something about tonight's brief exchange suggested that beneath his ice, something more complicated stirred. Something neither of them fully understood yet. Over the following days, she noticed small changes in how the palace treated her. Subtle shifts that suggested Draven's attention, however reluctant, carried weight throughout his court. Servants, who had once hesitated, now greeted her openly. Nobles, who had whispered behind gloved hands, now offered polite nods when she passed. Even Freya, though still cold, no longer made her disapproval quite so publicly obvious. Lyra understood that this shift meant something larger was happening, something neither she nor Draven had intended when they exchanged vows of threat and defiance at their forced wedding. Whatever ice existed between them had not melted, not yet, but it had begun to crack in small, unexpected places, and she found herself wondering, despite every reason not to, what might eventually be found beneath it. She spent that evening in her chambers, the fire finally warm and steady thanks to Talia's now regular attention, staring into the flames and turning over everything that had happened since her arrival. A king who had promised to break her had instead begun watching her with something other than hatred. A court that had wanted her gone had slowly, grudgingly, begun to accept her presence among them. And somewhere beneath all of it, a girl who had left Ashfell expecting only survival had begun, quietly and without permission, to build something that almost resembled a home. Whatever came next, she suspected it would not be simple. But for the first time since crossing the mountain pass into Veyrath, Lyra allowed herself a small flicker of hope, fragile and uncertain, that perhaps this cold kingdom held more possibility than she had first believed. The archive tower stood at the far edge of the palace grounds, a narrow structure of gray stone that most of the court avoided entirely, considering it Aldrich's private domain and little else. Lyra had begun visiting more frequently as her reading skills improved, drawn less by curiosity now, and more by a growing need to understand the wound at the center of her husband's coldness. If she was going to share her life with a man shaped by grief, she wanted to understand the shape of that grief clearly, rather than through second-hand whispers and careful half-explanations. Aldrich welcomed her into the deeper archive rooms one afternoon, sensing perhaps that her questions had grown more pointed, more purposeful. He led her past shelves of treaties and tax records into a smaller chamber where personal correspondence from the royal family had been carefully preserved, organized by year and by reign. It took little searching to find the section devoted to the years surrounding the death of Draven's first mate, a young woman named Alira, whose name Lyra noted with a strange, uncomfortable recognition of how closely it echoed her own. The official records told a simple story. A raiding party had crossed from human territory under cover of darkness, striking a border outpost where Alira had been visiting family, and she had died in the chaos, alongside several wolf guards stationed there for protection. The raid had never been fully explained, the attackers never captured, and the incident had become one of the primary grievances, fueling years of conflict between Veyrath and the human territories, including Ashfell itself. But as Lyra read further, cross-referencing dates and names with Aldrich's patient guidance, small inconsistencies began to surface. A supply requisition form, dated just days before the raid, showed unusual movement of weapons from the palace armory itself, weapons that were never accounted for afterward. A guard roster revealed that the outpost had been left with fewer defenders than protocol required, an oversight that seemed too convenient to be accidental. And a single letter, tucked away in a folder marked only with a wax seal Lyra did not recognize, hinted at internal disputes among Draven's own council members regarding trade agreements that Alira had publicly opposed before her death. Lyra sat back from the table, her pulse quickening as the pieces began forming an uncomfortable picture. "What does this mean?" she asked Aldrich quietly, though some part of her already suspected the answer. Aldrich's expression grew grave, his weathered hands folding carefully atop the old documents. "It means," he said slowly, "that the raid may not have come from human territory at all, or if it did, someone within these walls made certain it succeeded, someone who benefited from Alira's death and the war that followed it." The weight of this revelation settled heavily over Lyra's shoulders. If this was true, then everything Draven believed about her people, every wound that had shaped his coldness and fueled his threat at their altar, rested on a foundation built from lies. Her own town, her own family, had been blamed for a tragedy they may have had no part in causing. while the true culprits remained hidden safely within the very court that mourned Elira's loss. She thought immediately of exposing the truth, of bringing these documents directly to Draven, and demanding he finally see clearly what his own grief had blinded him to for years. But caution held her back. If someone within his own council had orchestrated Elira's death to benefit from the resulting war, that same person likely still held power and influence within these walls, and exposing such a secret carelessly could put both her and Aldrich in danger before the truth ever reached the king's ears. "I need more proof before I bring this to him," she said finally, her voice steady, despite the uncertainty churning within her. "Something that cannot be dismissed as coincidence or misunderstanding." Aldrich nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom in her caution, even as concern flickered across his aged features. "Then we must be careful how we search further," he said. "Whoever hid these inconsistencies did so carefully. They will notice if someone begins asking the wrong questions too loudly." Over the following days, Lyra continued her research with heightened caution, careful never to remove documents from the archive tower, careful never to discuss her findings anywhere she might be overheard. She began quietly observing the council members who had served during the years surrounding Elira's death, noting which ones still held positions of power, which ones seemed nervous whenever old grievances against humans were raised in casual conversation. One name kept surfacing more than others: Lord Osgood, an aging council member responsible for trade agreements with neighboring territories, had opposed Elira's position on human relations quite publicly before her death, according to several old letters Lyra uncovered. His fortunes had grown considerably in the years since the war began, his family's trade routes expanding into territories that would have remained closed had peace held instead of conflict. She mentioned this pattern carefully to General Silas one evening, framing her questions as simple curiosity about the palace's political history, rather than revealing the full scope of what she and Aldrich had uncovered. Silas's expression grew thoughtful, cautious, and he admitted quietly that he had always harbored certain suspicions about Osgood's rapid rise during the war years, suspicions he had never voiced aloud for lack of proof. "Be careful, Lyra," he warned her seriously. "If your instincts are correct, you are treading into dangerous territory. Men who profit from war do not appreciate having their profits questioned, especially not by a queen the court already views with suspicion." She heeded his warning, slowing her investigation, careful to leave no obvious trail that might lead back to her curiosity. But the knowledge she now carried weighed heavily upon her conscience, especially whenever she found herself in Draven's presence, watching him carry grief for a wound that may have been inflicted by someone standing at his own council table, rather than by anyone from her homeland at all. Their interactions had grown slightly more frequent since the dinner incident with Lady Freya, though still formal, still carefully guarded on both sides. Draven had taken to walking the gardens some evenings, and more than once Lyra found herself crossing paths with him there, their conversations brief but no longer entirely cold. He asked, once, how her lessons with Aldrich progressed, and she answered honestly without mentioning the true focus of her recent research. "You seem distracted lately," he observed one evening, studying her with the same careful intensity that always made her pulse quicken despite her best efforts to remain composed. "Is something troubling you?" She considered, briefly, telling him everything right then, unable to bear the weight of the secret pressing against her chest any longer. But the memory of Silas's warning held her back, and instead, she offered only a partial truth. "I have been thinking about the past," she said carefully, "about wounds that never fully heal, and whether the stories we tell ourselves about those wounds are always entirely accurate." Something flickered across Draven's features, a shadow of old grief mixed with something sharper, more guarded. "Some wounds do not need re-examining," he said, his voice carrying a warning edge she had not heard directed at her in weeks. "Some truths are settled, regardless of how uncomfortable they remain." "And if the truth you believe is not the truth that actually happened," she pressed gently, choosing her words with careful precision, "would you want to know? Even if knowing changed everything you believed about the people you have blamed." He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his cold eyes, and for a moment she thought he might ask her directly what she meant, might demand she explain herself fully. Instead, he simply turned away, his shoulders tense, his voice quiet when he finally spoke again. "Good night, Lyra," he said, and walked away without waiting for her response, leaving her standing alone among the darkening garden shadows, with her heart heavy from words left unspoken. She returned to her chambers that night more troubled than before, understanding now that the truth she carried would not be simple to reveal, that Draven's grief ran too deep, too tangled with years of blame directed at her own people, for a few old documents to easily unravel everything he had believed for so long. But she also understood, with growing certainty, that the truth deserved to be known, regardless of how difficult the reckoning might become. Somewhere within these palace walls, someone had built their fortune upon a tragedy they themselves had orchestrated, allowing an entire kingdom to blame the wrong enemy for years, while war claimed countless innocent lives on both sides of the mountain border. Lyra did not yet know how she would bring this truth to light safely, how she would protect Aldrich and herself, while dismantling a lie powerful men had profited from for years. But she knew, with the same quiet determination that had carried her from Ashfell to this cold northern kingdom, that she would find a way eventually, regardless of the risk involved or the pain the truth might cause when it finally surfaced. Draven's behavior shifted noticeably in the weeks that followed their conversation in the garden, though not in the direction Lyra had hoped. Where he had begun softening slightly, allowing brief moments of civility between them, he now seemed determined to prove something to himself, or perhaps to her, that his coldness had never truly wavered. He began assigning her tasks that seemed designed less to test her capability and more to test her endurance, as though searching for the breaking point he had promised at their altar and still had not found. The first task arrived without warning, delivered through Corwin with the same flat efficiency he had shown during their journey north months earlier. The Queen would oversee preparations for a diplomatic gathering, with representatives from 3 neighboring territories, a task typically assigned to experienced court officials with years of training in etiquette and negotiation. Lyra had barely 2 weeks to prepare, no formal guidance offered, and an unspoken expectation that failure would confirm every doubt the court still harbored about her worthiness. She did not complain. Instead, she called upon everyone who had shown her kindness since her arrival. Osric helped plan a menu that honored each visiting territory's customs, without favoring one over another. Aldrich assisted with proper greetings in each delegation's native tongue, ensuring she could welcome every guest without stumbling over unfamiliar syllables. Silas advised her on seating arrangements that avoided reigniting old political tensions between territories with complicated histories. When the gathering finally arrived, Lyra moved through the evening with a composure that surprised even those who had begun to respect her. She greeted each delegation properly, navigated a tense moment when 2 territories nearly clashed over disputed trading rights, and smoothed the disagreement with a suggestion so diplomatically balanced that both sides left satisfied. Draven watched from across the hall throughout the evening, his expression unreadable, though Lyra noticed his eyes rarely strayed far from her for long. The gathering succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, and word of the human queen's unexpected competence spread quickly through the court in the days that followed. But rather than easing his testing, Draven seemed to escalate it, as though her success only fueled his determination to find some limit to what she could endure. He began exposing her deliberately to the court's cruelest members, seating her beside nobles known for their sharp tongues during formal dinners, assigning her to committees where Lady Freya and her allies dominated discussion with thinly veiled insults. He offered no protection, no intervention, watching from a careful distance, as though conducting some private experiment to measure exactly how much scorn she could absorb before finally crumbling beneath it. Lyra understood what he was doing, even without him explaining it directly. She had grown skilled at reading the subtle language of his silences, the careful way he positioned himself just close enough to observe, but never close enough to interfere. She refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her struggle, meeting every insult with calm grace, every challenge with quiet competence, that slowly won over even some of her harshest critics. It was during this period that she began forming deeper alliances within the court, not through calculated strategy, but through the same genuine warmth she had shown from the very beginning. General Silas became something closer to a trusted friend, offering guidance not just on matters of court politics, but on understanding the pack's deeper customs and history. Marin continued teaching her healing arts, their friendship deepening into something resembling family, the healer often staying late into the evening, simply to share stories over shared cups of tea. Even young Talia, once so stiff and formal, began speaking more freely during their quiet moments together, revealing a sharp wit hidden beneath her professional reserve. occasionally sharing court gossip that proved surprisingly useful for Lyra's growing understanding of palace politics. And Osric, gruff as ever, had taken to setting aside her favorite foods from the kitchen without being asked, a small gesture that meant more to Lyra than any formal gift could have. Slowly, without any grand announcement or deliberate campaign, Lyra found herself surrounded by a quiet network of loyalty within the very palace that had once seemed determined to see her fail. Servants who had once avoided her now sought her out with small requests or simple conversation. Lower-ranking nobles who had initially followed Freya's lead in dismissing her now offered cautious respect, some even defending her subtly during court discussions when Draven was not present to notice. This growing influence did not escape Draven's attention, though he seemed uncertain how to interpret it. He mentioned it once, almost accusingly, during one of their rare private conversations in the garden. "You are building something within my own house," he said, his tone carrying suspicion rather than accusation. "Loyalty. Influence. I did not expect a treaty bride to accumulate power so quickly. I am simply treating people with respect, and they are choosing, on their own, to return that respect. If that frightens you, perhaps the problem lies less with my intentions, and more with how rarely such kindness has been offered within these walls before now." Her words seemed to strike something within him, a flicker of discomfort crossing his features before he masked it once again behind careful neutrality. He said nothing further that evening, simply studying her for a long moment before turning away. But Lyra noticed, in the days that followed, a subtle shift in his behavior. The testing did not stop entirely, but it grew less deliberate, less cruel, as though some part of him had begun questioning whether breaking her was truly what he wanted, or whether it had simply become habit born from old grief he had never properly examined. One evening, during a particularly difficult council session where several lords openly questioned whether a human queen should hold any influence over palace matters at all, Lyra found herself defending her position with more passion than she had intended. She spoke of Ashfell's suffering during the Long War, of families torn apart by conflict neither side truly understood anymore, of her belief that peace required more than simple treaties, it required genuine understanding between peoples who had spent too many years viewing each other as enemies rather than neighbors. Her words silenced the room more effectively than any authority Draven himself could have wielded. Several lords exchanging uncertain glances, clearly unprepared for such conviction, from someone they had dismissed as merely a political pawn. Draven, seated at the head of the table, watched her with an expression Lyra could not fully read, something between surprise and reluctant admiration flickering behind his usually guarded eyes. After the council session ended, he found her alone in the corridor outside the chamber, his expression uncharacteristically hesitant. "That was well spoken," he said quietly, the closest thing to genuine praise he had offered since their wedding day. "I meant every word," she replied simply. "I know," he said, and something in his voice carried a weight she had not heard before, an acknowledgement perhaps that he was beginning to understand she was not the simple political tool he had assumed her to be at their altar months earlier. Then, before she could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving her once again standing alone in the quiet corridor, her heart beating strangely fast, uncertain what to make of the growing complexity forming between them. That night, as she prepared for sleep in her chambers, now considerably warmer thanks to Talia's consistent attention and a small collection of personal touches Lyra had slowly added over the months, she found herself reflecting on how much had changed since her arrival. She had come to Veyrath expecting only survival, expecting a king determined to break her, and a court determined to see her fail. Instead, she had built quiet alliances throughout the palace, earned respect from unlikely sources, and begun to glimpse something beneath Draven's coldness that suggested his heart, however guarded, was not as frozen as his wedding day threat had suggested. She did not yet trust this shift completely, understanding that grief as deep as his did not simply dissolve because of a few moments of vulnerability shared in quiet corridors. But for the first time since arriving in this cold northern kingdom, Lyra allowed herself to wonder whether the man she had married might eventually become something more than the enemy he had first appeared to be, whether the ice between them might one day thaw into something neither of them had expected to find within a marriage born from war and treaty rather than choice. The attack came on a night that had begun like any other, quiet and unremarkable, the palace settling into its usual evening rhythms, as guards changed shifts and servants finished their final rounds before retiring. Lyra had been walking back from the healer's quarters, her arms full of dried herbs Marin had asked her to store properly, when she first heard the commotion echoing from the eastern wing, where Draven's private study was located. Shouts rang through the corridors, followed by the unmistakable clash of steel against steel, sounds that sent every instinct in her body toward alarm even before she understood what was happening. She dropped the herbs without hesitation and ran toward the noise, ignoring the small voice of caution that suggested she should instead run in the opposite direction toward safety. She arrived to find chaos, 3 armed intruders wearing unfamiliar colors locked in combat with Draven's personal guards, the king himself fighting fiercely despite an already bleeding wound along his forearm. Callum, his loyal guard, had fallen near the doorway, struggling to rise after taking a hard blow to the head, and one of the intruders was moving toward Draven's exposed side, while his attention remained fixed on the attacker directly before him. Lyra did not think. She grabbed a heavy iron candelabra from a nearby table and swung it with all her strength directly into the approaching intruder's shoulder, throwing off his balance just enough to disrupt his attack before he could strike Draven from behind. The intruder stumbled, momentarily stunned, and Silas, arriving moments later with reinforcements, quickly subdued him along with his remaining companions. The fighting ended within minutes, the intruders either captured or fled, but the aftermath left the corridor littered with wounded guards and shattered furniture. Draven stood breathing heavily, his forearm bleeding steadily, his eyes finding Lyra across the chaos, with an expression she had never seen him wear before, something raw and unguarded, that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. "You should not have come here," he said, though his tone carried none of its usual coldness, only something closer to genuine concern. "You would be dead if I hadn't," she replied simply, already moving toward him to examine his wound, with the same practical efficiency Marin had taught her over the previous months. He allowed her to tend him, sitting silently while she cleaned and bandaged the gash along his forearm, his eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her hands tremble slightly despite her efforts to remain steady. Neither spoke while she worked, the silence between them charged with something neither had acknowledged before, something that had been building slowly beneath months of careful distance and cautious testing. Once the wound was properly bandaged, Marin arrived to take over his care fully, and Lyra stepped back, suddenly aware of how close she had been standing, how intimately she had touched his skin while tending his injury. Draven caught her wrist gently before she could retreat further, his grip firm but not harsh, his eyes searching hers with an urgency she had not expected. "Why?" he asked quietly, his voice rough with something that sounded almost like disbelief. "Why would you risk yourself for me, after everything I said to you at our altar, after everything I have done since to test you, to push you toward breaking?" Lyra considered his question carefully, understanding that her answer mattered more than she fully grasped in this charged moment. "I didn't marry a cause, Draven," she finally said, her voice steady despite the vulnerability of the moment. "I married a man. Whatever grief shaped you before I arrived, whatever anger you carried into our wedding day, none of that changes the fact that you are still a person, one who did not deserve to die tonight regardless of how you have treated me since we met." His grip on her wrist loosened, though he did not release her entirely, his expression shifting into something she had never seen him wear, something almost like shame, layered beneath surprise. "I have been unfair to you," he admitted quietly, the words seeming to cost him considerable effort to speak aloud. "I blamed you for wounds you never inflicted, tested you cruelly for sins that were never yours to answer for." "You have," she agreed simply, refusing to soften the truth simply because he finally seemed ready to hear it. "But tonight is not the time for this conversation. You are wounded, and there are guards to tend, and an investigation to begin into who sent these attackers against you." He nodded slowly, releasing her wrist entirely, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer, before Marin insisted he rest properly, to allow his wound time to heal. Lyra remained in the palace throughout the following hours, helping tend other wounded guards, coordinating with Silas as he began questioning the captured intruders about who had sent them and why. The investigation revealed disturbing details over the following days. The attackers belonged to a rival pack from the Eastern Territories, one that had long harbored ambitions of expanding their influence at Veyrath's expense. But more troubling still, evidence suggested someone within Draven's own court had provided information about his schedule and the study's typically light security during evening hours, someone with intimate knowledge of palace routines that only a trusted insider could possess. Silas brought this information to Draven directly, once he had recovered enough to resume his duties, and Lyra, present during the discussion at Draven's own insistence, watched the king's expression darken with fresh suspicion as the implications settled over him. Someone within these walls had betrayed him, had provided the means for a rival pack to nearly succeed in assassinating their own king. "We must investigate carefully," Silas advised, his tone grave. "Whoever provided this information holds a position of trust, likely someone with access to your private schedule and study. We cannot move carelessly, or we risk alerting them before we have proof sufficient to act." Draven's jaw tightened, his eyes hardening with renewed determination despite his recovering wound. "Then we will investigate carefully," he said firmly, "and we will find whoever did this, regardless of how long it takes, or how uncomfortable the truth proves to be once uncovered." Lyra felt her pulse quicken at his words, understanding suddenly that this investigation might lead directly toward the very secrets she and Aldrich had uncovered months earlier regarding Alira's death and Lord Osgood's suspicious rise in fortune. If someone within the court had betrayed Draven now, perhaps for similar reasons of ambition and profit, the two mysteries might be more closely connected than anyone yet realized. She said nothing of her suspicions that evening, wanting more certainty before risking such a significant revelation, but she resolved to accelerate her own quiet investigation, alongside whatever official inquiry Silas and Draven pursued. The truth, whatever shape it finally took, needed to surface fully now, before more blood was spilled protecting lies that had already cost too many lives, across too many years of unnecessary conflict. As the palace slowly settled back into uneasy calm over the following days, Draven's behavior toward Lyra shifted more noticeably than ever before. He sought her company more frequently, their conversations growing longer, touching on subjects beyond simple court business, into more personal territory neither had dared explore previously. He asked about her childhood in Ashfell, about her family, about the sister she had protected by taking her place at this very altar that had once threatened to break her. She answered honestly, watching something soften increasingly behind his guarded eyes with each shared memory, each small vulnerability offered freely between them. The ice that had defined their relationship since their wedding day had not fully melted, not yet, but something warmer had begun growing in its place, fragile and uncertain, built from shared danger and reluctant honesty, rather than the careful distance they had maintained for so many months. Neither spoke aloud of what this growing warmth might mean for their future together, both perhaps too cautious, too wounded by past experiences, to name it directly. But as Lyra lay awake that night, listening to the familiar howls echoing through the mountain valley beyond her window, she found herself thinking not of escape or resentment, but of a king who had nearly died protecting his kingdom, and a queen who had risked everything without hesitation to ensure he survived to see another dawn. Draven's recovery required several weeks of careful rest, a fact that frustrated him considerably, given his usual restless energy, but one that brought him into closer daily contact with Lyra than any deliberate arrangement could have achieved. Marin insisted he remain in his private chambers during the initial healing period, and Lyra found herself visiting more frequently than strictly necessary, first to assist with changing bandages, then simply to share conversation as the days passed slowly within his quiet rooms. He taught her, during one such afternoon, the proper stance for holding a blade, laughing softly, genuinely, for perhaps the first time since she had arrived in Veyrath, when her initial attempts left her nearly toppling over from poor balance. His laughter transformed his entire face, softening the sharp lines that grief had carved there over the years, revealing glimpses of the man he might have been, before tragedy reshaped him into someone colder, more guarded than his true nature ever intended. "You are terrible at this," he said, still smiling as he adjusted her grip on the practice blade, his hands warm against hers, in a way that sent unexpected warmth spreading through her chest. "I have spent my life working iron in my father's forge, not swinging swords," she replied, feigning offense despite her own smile threatening to break through her mock indignation. "Perhaps you should be teaching me something more useful, like how to properly shoe a horse." "I already know you can do that," he replied, surprising her with the knowledge. Edwin mentioned it once, quite proudly, how the Queen learned faster than any stable hand he has trained in decades. She flushed slightly at this unexpected praise relayed secondhand, understanding suddenly how closely he had been paying attention to her life throughout the palace, despite his careful distance during those earlier months. Their afternoon lessons continued over subsequent days, blade work giving way eventually to quieter conversations about history, about the wolf tongue's more complex grammar structures, about small memories from childhood that neither had shared with anyone else in years. It was during one such quiet afternoon that Draven finally spoke more openly about Alira, his first mate, than he ever had before. He described her gentle nature, her passion for diplomacy, her belief that lasting peace required understanding rather than simple military dominance over rival territories. He spoke of finding her body after the raid, of the guilt that had consumed him for failing to protect her, guilt that had gradually calcified into anger, directed outward at the people he believed responsible. "I have carried that anger for so long," he admitted quietly, his eyes distant with old memory, "that I am not certain who I would be without it. It became easier to hate than to grieve properly, easier to blame an entire people than to sit with the simple truth that I failed to protect someone I loved." Lyra listened without interrupting, understanding the weight of what he was sharing, recognizing the courage it required for a man so guarded to finally speak these buried truths aloud. When he finished, she reached out gently, resting her hand over his where it lay upon the bed covers between them, offering comfort without words that might feel inadequate against grief so deep and so long carried. "Grief does not mean you failed her," she said softly. "It means you loved her deeply enough that her loss still shapes you years later. But Draven, hatred and grief are not the same thing, however closely they may feel intertwined. You can honor her memory without continuing to punish an entire people, including me, for a tragedy that may not have unfolded the way you have always believed." Something flickered across his features at her words, a question forming behind his eyes that he seemed almost afraid to voice aloud. "What do you mean?" he finally asked carefully. "May not have unfolded that way." Lyra hesitated, understanding that the moment had arrived to share what she and Aldrich had uncovered months earlier, though uncertainty about the timing and his reaction still gave her pause. She had wanted more proof before bringing such devastating information to him, but perhaps now, in this moment of unexpected honesty and growing trust between them, the truth deserved to finally surface, regardless of remaining uncertainties. "I have found things," she said carefully, "in the archives. Records that suggest the raid that killed Alira may not have originated entirely from human territory, as everyone has always believed. There are inconsistencies, missing weapons from your own armory, guard rosters that were altered just before the attack, financial records showing certain members of your own council benefited significantly from the war that followed her death." Draven's expression shifted rapidly through several emotions, disbelief giving way to something closer to fury, though she noticed with relief that his anger did not seem directed at her for revealing this information. "Who?" he demanded, his voice sharp with barely restrained emotion. "Who within my own court would orchestrate such a thing?" "We do not have complete proof yet," she cautioned, "though the pattern points toward Lord Osgood. His fortunes grew considerably during the war years, his trade routes expanding into territories that would have remained closed had peace held instead of conflict, and he opposed Alira's diplomatic positions quite publicly before her death." Draven fell silent for a long moment, processing this revelation with visible effort, years of carefully constructed belief crumbling before entirely new possibilities he had never allowed himself to consider. "Why did you not tell me sooner?" he finally asked, though his tone carried more confusion than accusation. "Because I feared for both our safety if the wrong person discovered we were investigating before we had sufficient proof," she explained honestly. "And because I was uncertain how you would receive such information, given how deeply this grief has shaped you for so many years." He absorbed this explanation slowly, something like understanding, even gratitude, settling into his expression despite the turmoil clearly churning beneath his composed exterior. "You protected this information carefully," he finally said. "Protected me, even while I treated you cruelly, for wounds that may never have been inflicted by your people at all. I made a choice at our altar, Draven," she said quietly. "I chose to build something within these walls rather than simply survive them. That choice did not depend on whether you deserved my kindness. It depended on who I wanted to be, regardless of how you treated me in return." His eyes softened further at her words, something vulnerable and unguarded passing between them that neither dared name directly. He reached for her hand then, holding it gently within his own, his thumb tracing small circles against her palm, in a gesture that felt more intimate than anything they had shared since their forced wedding months earlier. "I do not deserve such loyalty," he admitted quietly, "but I am deeply grateful for it nonetheless." Their conversation was interrupted moments later by Callum's arrival, bearing urgent news about the ongoing investigation into the assassination attempt, and the fragile intimacy of the moment dissolved back into the practical concerns of ruling a kingdom still recovering from attempted violence. But something had shifted between them regardless, a foundation of trust and honesty that had not existed before, built from shared danger, unexpected vulnerability, and a truth finally spoken aloud, after being carefully guarded for too long. Yet even as this new closeness grew between them, Draven found himself retreating slightly in the days that followed, old guilt resurfacing alongside the shocking revelation about Alira's true fate. Loving again, even simply allowing himself closeness with Lyra, felt somehow like betraying Alira's memory, as though moving forward meant forgetting the woman whose death had shaped so much of his life since her loss. He grew quieter during their subsequent conversations, more guarded, the warmth that had bloomed so unexpectedly between them, cooling slightly beneath the weight of his renewed internal conflict. Lyra noticed this withdrawal but did not push, understanding that grief required its own timeline, that trust rebuilt after years of careful walls could not simply solidify overnight, regardless of how much progress they had made. She continued her quiet investigation alongside Aldrich, gathering additional evidence against Lord Osgood, while allowing Draven the space he needed to process everything that had shifted so dramatically within his understanding of his own painful history. Whatever came next, she understood that the path forward would not be simple, that a man carrying such deep and long-buried grief could not simply set aside years of careful walls overnight, however genuine the growing warmth between them had become. But she remained patient, trusting that the foundation they had built together, however fragile, would prove strong enough to weather whatever difficult truths still waited to be fully uncovered and confronted in the days ahead. The proof they needed finally surfaced through an unexpected source. Talia, who had grown close to Lyra over the preceding months, approached her one evening with troubling news gathered from her own network of servant friends throughout the palace. A junior clerk working under Lord Osgood had recently confided, after too much wine at a servants' gathering, that his master had been burning old documents late into the night. Documents the clerk described as financial records dating back many years, far older than typical administrative business would require. Lyra brought this information immediately to Silas, who arranged quietly for the clerk to be questioned privately, away from Osgood's watchful influence. Under careful and patient questioning, the young clerk revealed considerably more than he likely intended, including his growing suspicion that his master had been destroying evidence connected somehow to the recent assassination attempt against the king. Alongside older records, the clerk did not fully understand, but had been instructed never to discuss with anyone. This testimony, combined with the inconsistencies Lyra and Aldrich had uncovered in the archive tower, finally provided sufficient grounds for Silas to request a formal investigation into Lord Osgood's activities, both recent and historical. Draven authorized the investigation immediately upon hearing the clerk's testimony, his expression hardening with the same controlled fury Lyra had witnessed the night of the assassination attempt, though now directed at a different, more insidious enemy hidden within his own trusted circle. The investigation moved swiftly once authorized, guards searching Osgood's private chambers and discovering, despite his attempts at destroying evidence, sufficient remaining documentation to confirm the worst suspicions. Records revealed that Osgood had indeed orchestrated the original raid that killed Alira, hiring mercenaries disguised as human raiders to attack the border outpost, ensuring the blame would fall squarely upon Ashfell and its neighboring territories rather than upon himself. His motives, as suspected, centered entirely on profit, the resulting war-opening trade routes and political opportunities that peace under Alira's diplomatic influence would have permanently closed to him. Further investigation revealed his connection to the recent assassination attempt as well, motivated this time by fear that Draven's growing trust in Lyra and her quiet investigation alongside Aldrich threatened to finally expose his decades-old crime. He had reached out to the rival Eastern Pack, providing information about palace security in exchange for their cooperation in eliminating the king before the truth could fully surface and end his carefully constructed life of accumulated wealth and influence. When Draven finally confronted Osgood directly, the older wolf's composure crumbled entirely. Years of carefully maintained deception, giving way to desperate justification, as guards restrained him for formal judgment. He spoke of political necessity, of believing peace with humans would weaken Veyrath permanently, of convincing himself over the years that his actions had ultimately served the kingdom's greater good, despite the personal cost to Alira and countless others who died during the resulting war. Draven listened to these justifications with visible restraint, his hands clenched at his sides, his jaw tight with barely controlled emotion. When Osgood finally finished speaking, Draven's voice emerged low and dangerous, carrying more weight than any shout could have conveyed. "You murdered the woman I loved," he said quietly, "and let an entire kingdom believe a lie for years, sacrificing countless lives on both sides of a border to protect your own fortune and ambition. There is no justification you can offer that changes what you truly are." Osgood was taken away for formal judgment before the full council, his crimes laid bare before the very lords who had once respected his position and influence. The revelation sent shockwaves through the court, forcing many nobles to confront uncomfortable truths about how easily they had accepted convenient lies, rather than questioning the true origins of a war that had cost so many lives over the years. For Draven, the revelation proved even more devastating on a personal level, forcing him to reckon fully with years of misplaced anger, directed at an entire people who had never truly wronged him. He retreated briefly into private grief once the investigation concluded, needing time alone to process the full weight of what had been uncovered. Time to mourn Alira properly, now that he finally understood the true circumstances of her death, and time to reckon with how deeply his misguided anger had shaped his treatment of Lyra since their very first meeting at the altar. Lyra gave him this space, understanding instinctively that some reckonings could not be rushed, that grief this deep required patience rather than pressure to fully process and heal. She continued her regular duties throughout the palace, tending to the growing relationships she had built with staff and nobles alike, while quietly awaiting whatever conclusion Draven would reach once he had fully absorbed the magnitude of the truth finally revealed. He came to her eventually, several days later, finding her in the palace gardens where she had first encountered him, watching her from a careful distance months earlier. His expression carried a weariness that spoke of difficult nights and harder self-reflection, but also something new, a clarity that had not existed in his features since before Alira's death had first hardened him into the cold king Lyra had married. "I have spent years blaming an entire people for a crime committed by someone within my own walls," he said quietly, standing before her without his usual careful distance. "I threatened you at our altar, for sins you never committed, tested you cruelly, for wounds that were never inflicted by your hands, or your people's hands. I do not know how to properly apologize for such a profound failure of judgment." "You do not need to apologize with perfect words," Lyra replied gently, understanding that his vulnerability in this moment mattered more than any formal speech he might craft. "You simply need to choose, moving forward, to see clearly, rather than through the lens of old grief and misplaced blame. That choice matters more than any apology could." He nodded slowly, something settling within his expression that spoke of genuine resolution, rather than simple temporary regret. "There is something else," he continued, his voice growing more hesitant. "Osgood's betrayal threatens more than simply my own understanding of the past. Several council members loyal to him remain within the court, and they will not accept his judgment quietly. There may be further danger ahead as his allies attempt to protect their own positions, or seek revenge for his downfall." Lyra absorbed this warning seriously, understanding that the danger surrounding them had not fully passed simply because Osgood's initial crimes had been exposed. "Then we face that danger together," she said firmly, "as we should have been facing everything from the very beginning of this marriage, rather than as enemies forced into an uneasy truce by circumstance alone." Draven's expression softened at her words, something warm and genuine passing between them that finally felt unguarded by old walls or careful distance. "Together," he repeated quietly, as though testing the word's weight for the first time, finding it fit more comfortably than he had expected after months of careful isolation from genuine connection. In the days that followed, the court remained tense as Osgood's remaining allies grew increasingly desperate, whispers of potential retaliation circulating through the palace corridors, despite Silas's efforts to maintain order and security. Lady Freya, whose family held connections to Osgood's faction, grew notably nervous, her usual sharp comments toward Lyra replaced by careful, watchful silence that suggested she understood the shifting tides of power, now moving against those who had once benefited from the old lies. Draven and Lyra spent increasing time together during this uncertain period, no longer maintaining the careful distance that had once defined their relationship, but genuinely working alongside each other to secure the kingdom against further threats from Osgood's desperate allies. Their partnership, born from shared crisis and painful revealed truth, began forming into something neither had expected when they first exchanged threatening vows at their altar so many months earlier. Yet the greatest challenge still remained ahead of them. Osgood's allies would not simply accept defeat quietly, and the full reckoning for years of hidden betrayal had not yet fully concluded. Both Draven and Lyra understood that whatever peace they had begun building together would face its truest test in the days immediately following, as remaining threats within the court sought one final desperate attempt to protect the lies and privileges they had enjoyed for far too long, at the expense of countless innocent lives. The final confrontation arrived swiftly, catching even Silas's careful watch somewhat unprepared. Lord Osgood's closest ally, a council member named Corin, who had quietly benefited alongside him from years of war profiteering, gathered several disgruntled nobles and a small contingent of loyal guards in a desperate attempt to seize control before Osgood's full trial could expose additional names connected to the conspiracy. Their plan, poorly conceived in the panic of impending exposure, involved capturing both Draven and Lyra during a scheduled evening council meeting, hoping to force concessions that would protect their remaining fortunes and freedom. Fortunately, Talia's network of servant informants proved invaluable once again, catching whispered fragments of the plot mere hours before it could unfold. She rushed the warning to Lyra directly, who immediately alerted Silas and Draven, allowing them precious time to prepare, rather than being caught entirely unaware as Corin's faction had hoped. When the conspirators finally moved against the council chamber that evening, they found not the vulnerable targets they expected, but a fully prepared defense. Silas's loyal guards positioned strategically throughout the palace, Draven himself standing ready despite his still healing arm, and Lyra beside him, rather than hidden away for safety, as tradition might have dictated. She had insisted on standing with him, refusing to be treated as fragile cargo requiring protection, rather than a partner capable of facing danger alongside her husband. The confrontation proved brief but tense. Corin's poorly organized guards quickly overwhelmed by Silas's superior tactics and preparation. Corin himself attempted to flee once his plan's failure became apparent, but was captured before reaching the palace gates, his desperate justifications echoing Osgood's own earlier attempts to rationalize crimes committed purely for personal gain and ambition. In the aftermath, as guards secured the remaining conspirators and the palace slowly settled back into order, Draven turned to Lyra, with an expression that carried none of the coldness that had once defined their earliest interactions. "You stood beside me tonight rather than hiding away for your own safety," he said quietly, when tradition and simple caution might have suggested otherwise. "I told you once that I chose to build something within these walls rather than simply survive them," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "That choice includes standing beside you when danger threatens, not retreating behind walls while you face it alone." Something profound shifted in his expression at her words, a decision crystallizing behind his eyes that had perhaps been forming gradually over the many months since their difficult beginning. He reached for her hand, holding it firmly within his own, before the assembled court, guards and remaining nobles alike watching with evident surprise at this unprecedented public display of genuine affection from a king who had always guarded his emotions so carefully. "I spoke words at our altar that I have deeply regretted since discovering the truth about Alira's death," he said, his voice carrying clearly enough for those nearby to hear. "I promised you would beg for mercy, that I would never grant it. I was wrong. In every possible way a person can be wrong. You have shown more courage, more genuine strength, than anyone I have known in years, myself included." Lyra felt her heart racing at his words, understanding the significance of him speaking such vulnerability publicly, before a court that had once dismissed her entirely as an unwanted political obligation. "I never wanted your mercy, Draven," she replied honestly. "I only wanted to be seen clearly, for who I truly am, rather than who you assumed I would be." "Then let me offer something better than the mercy I once threatened to withhold," he said, his grip on her hand tightening slightly, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that spoke of genuine transformation, rather than mere political convenience. "Let me offer you a true partnership, built on honesty and respect rather than obligation and old grief. Whatever vow I spoke at our altar in anger and misplaced blame, I wish to replace it now with something real, something earned, through everything we have faced together since that difficult beginning. The assembled witnesses fell silent, sensing the weight of this moment, even without fully understanding every detail of what had transpired between the king and his human bride over the preceding months. Lyra studied his face carefully, searching for any remaining trace of the cold, guarded man who had once threatened her so cruelly, finding instead someone genuinely transformed by shared danger, painful truth, and the slow rebuilding of trust neither had expected to find within a marriage born from war and treaty. "I have spent this entire marriage refusing to beg," she said finally, a small smile beginning to form at the corner of her mouth. "I do not intend to start now, but I will admit, freely and honestly, that I have grown to care for the man standing before me, not the king who threatened me at our altar, but the person who has shown genuine courage in confronting his own painful past and choosing to change because of it." Draven's expression softened further, something like relief and profound gratitude passing through his features as her words settled between them. "Then perhaps," he said quietly, "we might consider beginning again, properly this time, without the shadow of grief and misplaced blame that has darkened everything since our first meeting." In the weeks that followed, as Corin and his remaining allies faced formal judgment before the full council, and as Osgood's trial concluded with a sentence appropriate to the magnitude of his decades-old crimes, the court slowly began adjusting to a transformed understanding of their queen and king's relationship. Lady Freya, whose family connections to the conspiracy had been thoroughly investigated and ultimately cleared of direct involvement, found herself surprisingly humbled by the entire ordeal, offering Lyra a cautious, genuine apology for her earlier cruelty that Lyra accepted with the same grace she had shown throughout her difficult months within these walls. The people of Veyrath, upon learning the true circumstances surrounding Alira's death and the subsequent years of manufactured conflict with human territories, began reconsidering their long-held assumptions about the border wars that had shaped so much suffering across multiple generations. Draven, working alongside Lyra, began drafting new diplomatic overtures toward Ashfell and other human territories, seeking genuine reconciliation rather than the uneasy truce that had defined their previous treaty arrangement. Word reached Ashfell eventually of the Queen's growing influence and the transformed relationship developing at Veyrath's royal court, bringing considerable relief to Lyra's family, who had spent months worrying about the daughter who had sacrificed herself in her sister's place. Letters began traveling between the two territories more frequently, carrying news of healing wounds on both sides of a conflict that had claimed too many lives, for reasons that had never truly justified such profound and lasting suffering. As the immediate dangers finally settled into genuine peace, both within the palace and along the border territories that had suffered so much during years of unnecessary war, Draven and Lyra found themselves standing together, one quiet evening, in the same garden, where their relationship had first begun shifting from cold hostility towards something warmer and more genuine. The threats spoken at their altar, born from grief and misplaced blame, had finally been fully replaced by something neither had expected to find within a marriage that began as simple political obligation. "I once vowed you would beg for mercy," Draven said quietly, watching the sunset paint the mountain peaks in warm shades of gold and amber. "I find now that I am the one who should be asking for something, not mercy, but rather the chance to properly earn what I once assumed I could simply demand through fear and threat." Lyra smiled at his words, understanding fully the transformation that had occurred within him since their difficult beginning months earlier. "And what is it you wish to earn?" she asked softly. "Your trust, fully and completely," he replied honestly. "Your genuine affection, not born from obligation or treaty, but chosen freely, the same way you have chosen everything else since arriving in this kingdom, that once wanted you gone, before you had even truly arrived." She reached for his hand then, lacing her fingers through his own, feeling the warmth of genuine connection, replacing the cold distance that had once defined their earliest interactions. "You have already begun earning it," she said quietly, watching the last light fade behind the distant peaks. "Every choice you have made since discovering the truth, every moment of vulnerability you have shared, every genuine effort toward change, rather than simply maintaining old patterns of anger and blame, has already begun building something real between us." They stood together in comfortable silence as darkness slowly settled over the mountain kingdom, the distant howls that had once seemed so frightening to Lyra, now carrying a familiar comfort, the sound of a home she had never expected to find within these cold stone walls when she first arrived so many months earlier, terrified and uncertain, prepared only to survive whatever awaited her, rather than to discover genuine happiness within a marriage born from war and treaty rather than choice. Spring arrived in Veyrath with a warmth the mountain kingdom rarely saw, the snow finally melting from the highest peaks, wildflowers beginning to dot the meadows below the palace walls. It felt fitting, Lyra thought, that the season of renewal should coincide with the plans now underway throughout the palace. Plans for a celebration, unlike anything the court had witnessed in generations. A wedding, chosen freely by both parties, rather than forced upon them by treaty and desperate necessity. Draven had proposed the idea himself, several weeks after Corrin's conspiracy had been fully dismantled, and Osgood's trial had concluded with appropriate judgment for his decades of hidden crimes. He had approached her one evening in the library, where she now spent considerable time continuing her studies with Aldrich, and had knelt before her with a humility that would have seemed impossible from the cold king she had first married. "I wish to marry you again," he had said simply, "this time with vows we both choose freely, without threat, without obligation, without the shadow of grief and misplaced blame that darkened our first ceremony. I wish the entire kingdom to witness a beginning, built on genuine choice, rather than forced necessity." Lyra had accepted without hesitation, understanding the significance of what he offered. A chance to reclaim the ceremony that had once been marked by threat and cold fury, replacing it with something built entirely from honest affection, freely chosen by two people, who had found their way toward each other, despite the most difficult possible beginning. The preparations that followed differed considerably from the rushed, joyless ceremony that had marked their first wedding. Osric threw himself into planning a feast that would honor both wolf and human traditions, insisting that dishes from Ashfell's own culinary heritage be included alongside Veyrath's traditional fare, a small but meaningful gesture acknowledging Lyra's homeland, rather than erasing it entirely beneath her new position. Marin helped design flower arrangements using herbs and blooms that carried symbolic meaning within wolf tradition, ensuring the ceremony honored the customs Lyra had worked so hard to learn and respect over her many months within these walls. Word had been sent to Ashfell as well, an invitation extended to Lyra's family that would have seemed impossible during her first difficult wedding, when she had walked alone down that long aisle with no one present to witness or support her. Her father, mother, and sister Wren arrived weeks before the ceremony, given proper chambers befitting honored guests rather than treated as afterthoughts to political necessity, and Lyra felt tears gathering in her eyes when she first embraced her family again after so many months apart. Wren, older now in bearing if not simply in years, embraced her sister tightly, her earlier guilt finally beginning to ease, as she witnessed firsthand how thoroughly Lyra had transformed her difficult circumstances into something resembling genuine happiness. "I never properly thanked you," Wren whispered during their reunion, "for taking my place at that altar, for facing everything alone that should have been mine to face instead." "You do not need to thank me," Lyra replied gently, holding her sister close. "I would make the same choice again, without hesitation, knowing everything I know now about the path that choice would lead me toward." Draven welcomed her family with a warmth that surprised even Lyra, who had witnessed his gradual transformation over the preceding months, but had not fully anticipated how genuinely he would embrace connection with her homeland and her family specifically. He spent considerable time speaking privately with her father, learning about the forge where Lyra had grown up, about the values and resilience that had shaped the woman he had come to love so deeply, despite their difficult beginning. The ceremony itself, when the day finally arrived, bore little resemblance to their first difficult wedding months earlier. The same grand hall hosted the celebration, but where cold formality and suspicious whispers had once dominated the atmosphere, now warmth and genuine celebration filled every corner. Lords and ladies who had once questioned Lyra's worthiness now watched with evident respect, many having witnessed firsthand her courage and competence throughout the preceding months of crisis and transformation. Lyra walked the aisle this time surrounded by family, rather than isolated among strangers, her father proudly escorting her toward the altar where Draven waited, his expression carrying none of the cold fury that had once marked their first meeting at this very spot. Instead, his eyes held only warmth and genuine anticipation, watching her approach with an openness that would have seemed impossible to imagine during their difficult beginning. When she reached the altar, he took her hands in his own, his thumb tracing gentle circles against her palm, exactly as he had done during that quiet afternoon in his recovery chambers months earlier, when trust between them had first begun genuinely forming. The priest, the same one who had presided over their first difficult ceremony, seemed to sense the profound difference in atmosphere, his own expression warmer, more genuinely engaged with the vows he would soon guide them through. When the moment arrived for Draven to speak his vows, he departed from tradition entirely, choosing words that carried deep personal meaning, rather than simple formal phrases expected during royal ceremonies. "I once stood at this very altar and made a vow born from grief and misplaced anger," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "I promised you would beg for mercy and that I would never grant it. I was wrong in every possible way a person could be wrong, and I have spent the months since discovering just how wrong, working to become someone worthy of the genuine partnership you deserved from the very beginning." He paused, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that spoke of complete sincerity. "Today, I offer a different vow entirely. I will never beg you to love me, nor demand it through threat or fear. I will simply never stop earning it, every single day, for as long as we both shall live, regardless of how long that path might prove to be." Lyra felt tears gathering in her eyes, genuine and joyful, rather than born from fear or uncertainty, as they might have been during their first ceremony. When her turn came to speak, she found the words flowing easily, carrying none of the careful defiance that had marked her earlier vow, spoken in cold challenge, rather than genuine affection. "I came to this kingdom prepared only to survive," she said, her voice steady, despite the emotion clearly present within it. "I found instead a home I never expected, friends who became like family, and a partner who has shown me that true strength lies not in refusing to bend, but in choosing, again and again, to grow towards something better, despite difficult beginnings. I once told you I never beg. That remains true today, but not because I refuse to be vulnerable with you. It is simply because you have given me nothing that would ever require begging. You have given, freely and consistently, everything I could have hoped to find within a marriage I never chose but have come to treasure completely." The hall erupted into genuine celebration, as the priest pronounced them bound once again, this time through vows both had chosen freely, rather than obligations forced upon them by treaty and desperate necessity. Draven pulled her close, and their kiss, unlike anything shared during their formal first ceremony, carried genuine warmth and joy that spread visibly through the assembled crowd, wolf lords and human family alike, celebrating together, in a manner that would have seemed impossible when Lyra first arrived at these palace gates so many months earlier. The feast that followed stretched long into the evening, laughter and music filling halls that had once echoed with suspicious whispers and cold formality. Silas raised his cup in a heartfelt toast to the queen, who had proven her worth many times over. General and queen, finding common ground in mutual respect, earned through shared crisis and genuine character. Osric's feast proved a triumph, blending traditions from both kingdoms in a manner that symbolized the broader reconciliation now underway between Veyrath and the human territories that had suffered so long under the shadow of manufactured conflict. Later that evening, as the celebration finally began winding down and guests slowly retired to their chambers, Draven and Lyra found themselves alone once again, in the same garden where so much of their relationship's true foundation had been built, through quiet conversations and gradual trust. The stars shone brightly above the mountain peaks, the same distant howls echoing through the valley below, no longer frightening but familiar and comforting, the sound of home Lyra had never expected to find within walls that had once seemed determined to see her fail entirely. "We have come a long way," Draven said quietly, pulling her close against him as they watched the stars together. "We have," she agreed, resting her head against his shoulder, feeling utterly at peace in a way she had not thought possible during those first difficult days after arriving in this cold northern kingdom. From threats spoken in anger, to vows chosen freely. From a king, determined to break me, to a partner who has shown me what genuine strength and vulnerability truly mean when combined together. Draven pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head, his arms tightening around her slightly. "I once vowed you would beg for mercy," he murmured softly. "I find now that mercy was never what either of us needed. What we needed was simply the courage to see each other clearly, to choose growth over old patterns of grief and anger. and to build something genuine from whatever difficult beginning circumstance had forced upon us. "And what would you call what we have built now?" Lyra asked softly, tilting her head to meet his gaze in the starlit darkness. He smiled then, genuine and unguarded, the coldness that had once defined him, completely transformed into warmth she had helped nurture through months of patience, courage, and unwavering authenticity. "I would call it home," he said simply, "and I would call you the reason I finally found my way back to becoming the man I always should have been, rather than the one grief and misplaced anger nearly convinced me to remain forever." They remained together in that quiet garden long into the night, two people who had begun as enemies forced together by desperate treaty, transformed through shared crisis and patient honesty, into genuine partners building a future neither had believed possible during that cold, difficult ceremony so many months earlier. The kingdom of Veyrath, healing alongside its king and queen, moved forward into a future built on truth rather than convenient lies, on genuine partnership between human and wolf rather than manufactured conflict, serving only the ambitions of those willing to sacrifice innocent lives for personal gain. And somewhere in that peaceful garden, beneath stars that had witnessed countless generations of this ancient kingdom's history, a queen who had once smiled defiantly at a threat of mercy, withheld now smiled again. This time, surrounded by genuine love, freely given, and freely returned, understanding fully that the greatest victories in life rarely come from refusing to bend, but rather from choosing, patiently and consistently, to build something better than what difficult circumstances first offered, regardless of how impossible that better future might have seemed at the very beginning.